The first truck came just after sunrise, its brakes hissing as it turned off Route 9 and onto the gravel drive at the edge of Millbrook Hollow. Then came a second truck, then a third. By noon, 6 flatbeds had rolled down that same stretch of road, each one groaning under a load of broken wooden pallets, and each one turning onto the same empty 5 acres behind the old Ashford barn. Workers in orange vests climbed down, unstrapped the loads, and let them fall. Splintered boards clattered against splintered boards. Cracked frames buckled under their own weight. Twisted lumber, gray with age and studded with bent nails, piled higher with every truck that came. By the end of that first week, the pile was taller than the barn roof. Neighbors slowed their cars to look. A few pulled over entirely, squinting through their windshields as if the mountain of broken wood might rearrange itself into something that made sense. It never did. It just kept growing. And the strangest part wasn't the size of the pile. It was the man standing next to it, clipboard in hand, waving in truck after truck, like he'd been waiting his whole life for exactly this. His name was Dean Ashford, and he kept asking the factory for more. Why would anyone want broken pallets? What was a packaging plant doing giving away truckload after truckload of wood nobody else would touch? And why did the man receiving it all look, of everyone watching that pile grow, like the only person who wasn't confused? By the time this story ends, that pile of garbage will have changed his life completely. But to understand how, you have to go back to the summer before the first truck ever arrived. Back to when Dean Ashford had nothing but 5 empty acres, a stack of unpaid bills, and a sentence his grandfather used to say that he hadn't thought about in years. If stories about ordinary people turning over looked opportunities into something extraordinary, keep you watching until the end. Go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. Drop a like right now if you're already wondering where a pile of broken pallets could possibly lead. And before we keep going, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this from today. Dean Ashford was 34 years old, and by his own account, not particularly good at anything except showing up. He'd spent 11 years at a cabinet hardware distributor 2 counties over, driving a forklift, loading trucks, doing the kind of steady, unglamorous work that pays the bills and not much else. Then the distributor consolidated its warehouses, and Dean's position was one of 40 that got restructured in a single afternoon. He came home that day and sat in his truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before he could make himself go inside and tell his wife, Carol. They had the 5 acres behind the old barn, land that had belonged to Dean's grandfather, Otis Ashford, and had sat mostly unused since Otis passed 6 years earlier. Property taxes on it were modest, but not nothing. And with Dean's income gone, modest but not nothing started to feel like a slow leak in a boat that already had too many. Dean thought about selling the land more than once that fall. A developer 2 towns over had already asked about it. But every time he drove past the old barn, he thought about his grandfather standing in the doorway of his workshop, sawdust on his forearms, saying the same thing he'd said to Dean 100 times growing up. Boy, there's no such thing as scrap wood. There's only wood nobody's looked at right yet. Otis had been a carpenter his whole life, not famous, not wealthy. Just the kind of man who could take a bent nail and a warped board and make something that outlasted him. Dean had spent countless childhood afternoons in that workshop, handing his grandfather tools, sweeping sawdust, not really listening to the lessons buried inside the old man's stories. He hadn't touched a woodworking tool in 15 years. He didn't know, that autumn, why his grandfather's words kept surfacing in his head while he sat in his truck outside the unemployment office. He just knew they wouldn't leave him alone. The opportunity came from an unlikely direction. A former co-worker who now worked logistics for Redline Freight and Packaging, a shipping and distribution operation 40 minutes north that moved goods for 6 regional retailers. Redline, he went through an enormous number of wooden pallets, receiving them, reusing them when possible, and disposing of the rest when they cracked, split, or simply wore out from being dropped, stacked, and forklifted across 1,000 loading docks. Disposal wasn't cheap. Landfill fees had climbed, and Redline's yard was drowning in broken pallets faster than their contracted hauler could clear them. Dean's old co-worker mentioned, almost as a joke, that Redline would probably pay somebody to just haul the things away. Dean didn't think of it as a joke. He drove up to Redline's yard on a Tuesday, half expecting to be laughed out of the parking lot. and instead found a logistics manager who looked at him like he'd solved a headache that had been building for months. Within 2 weeks, Dean had an informal agreement. Redline would deliver their broken pallets to his land at no cost to him, and in exchange, he'd take the volume off their hands. He told Carol that night, and she was quiet for a long moment before asking the only question that mattered. And then what? What do you do with a mountain of broken pallets? Dean didn't have a complete answer yet. He had a feeling and a grandfather's voice in his memory, and not much else. When the first truck started rolling in, the town noticed. Dean's neighbor, Gary Pruitt, leaned on his fence one afternoon and asked if Dean was planning to open a landfill. Someone posted a photo of the growing pile in the Millbrook Hollow community group online, captioned, "Anybody know what's going on behind the old Ashford place?" The comments were not kind. A few people used the word eyesore. One joked that Dean had lost his mind along with his job. Carol's sister asked, in the careful tone people use when they think you've made a mistake, but don't want to say so directly, whether Dean had a plan or just a pile. Dean kept asking Redline for more. What Dean was piecing together, slowly and mostly at night, after Carol had gone to bed, was this. Pallet wood, especially from a well-run operation like Redline, was almost always solid oak, pine, or occasionally maple. Real hardwoods, kiln-dried, structurally sound, apart from the specific spots where it had cracked or split. A standard shipping pallet is built from 9 boards and 3 runners, held together with nails driven at just enough of an angle to survive a forklift's rough handling. Most pallets don't fail because the wood itself gives out. They fail at the joints, where repeated impact eventually works. The nails looser splits the board around the nail hole. The boards that looked ruined at a glance were often 90% usable once you cut around the damage and worked past the outer inch or two that had taken the abuse. He started sorting by more than just size. Some boards had absorbed diesel or grease from years on a loading dock and were only good for structural framing, hidden inside a piece rather than shown on its surface. Others were clean, tight-grained, and worth saving for tabletops and visible faces. He learned to test for rot with nothing more than a thumbnail pressed into the end grain. Wood that gave too easily wasn't worth the time to mill. He learned that pine took stain unevenly unless he sealed it first, while the oak boards, heavier and harder to cut, held a natural richness that needed almost nothing done to it at all. What everyone else saw as garbage, Dean started to see as raw material that had already been paid for, kiln-dried, and delivered to his backyard for free. He didn't announce a business plan. He didn't have one yet. What he had was an idea that kept getting a little more specific every time he walked the pile with a flashlight after dinner. Not scrap lumber for burning, not mulch, not landscaping fill, furniture, real handcrafted furniture, coffee tables, shelving, benches, outdoor pieces, built from wood that told the story of where it came from. Rough edges and old nail holes left visible on purpose instead of sanded into anonymity. The scale of what he didn't know was almost comic. He had no formal training beyond what he half remembered from childhood afternoons in his grandfather's shop. His tools amounted to a decades-old table saw of Otis's, a cordless drill, and whatever he could borrow from neighbors who were more curious than convinced. He had no savings to speak of, no workshop beyond the open barn, and absolutely no customers. He was starting a furniture business with a stack of broken pallets and a memory of a man who died 6 years earlier. The first month in the barn taught Dean more about failure than 11 years at the distributor ever had. His first attempt at a coffee table split down the center within 2 days. He'd used wood from a section of the pile that had been rained on too long before he sorted it, and the moisture had weakened the grain in ways he couldn't see until the joints let go. His second attempt held together, but the legs came out uneven. He'd measured each one separately instead of cutting them as a set, and the table rocked visibly on Carol's kitchen floor. His third piece, a bench, collapsed under his own weight the first time he sat on it. He'd relied on the pallet's original nail holes instead of drilling fresh, properly countersunk joints, and the old wood had no strength left in those positions. Then came a stretch of early spring rain that got into the section of the barn where he'd been stacking cured lumber, warping nearly 2 weeks of sorted, ready-to-use boards beyond saving. His first actual customer, a woman 2 towns over who'd seen a shelf unit Dean posted in a local buy-sell trade group, complained that the finish felt tacky days after delivery. Dean had rushed the drying time on a humid afternoon because he was eager to close the sale. His early online listings, photographed in dim barn light against a cluttered background, drew almost no interest at all. He didn't understand yet that people buying handmade furniture were buying a feeling as much as an object, and his photos gave them nothing to feel. His grandfather's old table saw finally gave out entirely in April, the motor seizing mid-cut, and Dean spent money he didn't really have on a second-hand replacement, rather than lose 2 more weeks of momentum. And in May, a larger order, 6 matching benches for a small event venue, nearly fell through when Dean underestimated how long finishing and curing would actually take for a batch that size, forcing him into a frantic, sleep-deprived final week to deliver on time. Each failure cost him something. A weekend, a piece of wood he couldn't get back, occasionally a little money he genuinely couldn't spare. Each one also taught him something the last one hadn't. The split coffee table taught him to check moisture content with a cheap meter before committing good hours to a board, and to give rain-exposed lumber a full week under cover before trusting it. The uneven legs taught him to build a simple jig, so every cut on a run of identical parts came out exactly the same, instead of trusting his eye twice in a row. The collapsed bench taught him that a pallet's original nail holes were dead wood as far as strength was concerned, and that every real joint needed fresh, properly countersunk screws driven into solid material. The ruined batch of cured lumber taught him to build actual shelving off the barn floor instead of stacking boards where a bad storm could reach them. The unhappy first customer taught him that rushing a finish to close a sale always cost more time in the end than waiting the extra day would have. The quiet online listings taught him that a photograph in flat barn light told buyers nothing, and that showing a piece the way it would actually look in someone's home mattered as much as building it well. The seized table saw taught him that second-hand tools needed inspecting before he trusted them with a paying order, not after. And the frantic 6-bench order taught him, more than anything else that year, how to actually plan backward from a delivery date instead of just working hard and hoping the math worked out. None of these lessons arrived painlessly, and none of them arrived in the order he would have chosen. But by early summer, Dean had stopped thinking of the barn as a place where things kept going wrong, and started thinking of it as a place where he was, slowly and expensively, becoming someone who knew what he was doing. Carol watched him come in from the barn each night, hands scraped and sawdust caught in his hair, and later told him she never once heard him talk about quitting. She heard him talk about what he'd fix tomorrow. The first real win was small enough that Dean almost didn't recognize it as one. The woman with the tacky finish complaint gave him a second chance after he redid the piece, properly, and refinished it at his own cost. She left a short, genuine review online. Nothing dramatic, just a few honest sentences about a well-made shelf and a maker who'd stood behind his work. A friend of hers saw the post and asked about a matching bench. That was it. One order, one review, one referral. It was enough. Over the following months, the small wins started to compound. Better photographs, taken outdoors now, in real daylight, against a plain backdrop he built specifically for the purpose, brought better inquiries. A local coffee shop asked Dean to build a set of tables for their patio after seeing a piece he'd posted, and asked if he could put a small maker's tag on the underside, the first time anyone had asked to know his name attached to his work. He reinvested every dollar he could into better tools, a planer that saved him hours of hand sanding, a proper dust collection system that finally made the barn breathable, and eventually a small delivery trailer so he wasn't borrowing Carol's sister's truck every time an order went out. He also started keeping records the way his old distributor job had trained him to, tracking which piece designs sold fastest, which finishes people asked about most, how long each build actually took him from raw board to finished delivery. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant every new order was a little more accurate than the last, priced fairly instead of guessed at. None of it happened quickly. There was no single moment where the business took off. There was just a slow accumulation of slightly bigger orders, slightly better work, and a slightly longer list of people willing to vouch for him. By the end of that first full year, Dean had built and sold just over 60 individual pieces. Not enough to call it a living yet, but enough to know it wasn't a fluke. Just as the workshop started to feel less like chaos and more like a real operation, a supplier issue nearly stalled everything. Redline briefly changed hauling contractors, and for 6 anxious weeks, Dean's pallet supply thinned to almost nothing while the new arrangement got sorted out. He'd grown used to a steady stream of raw material, and its sudden scarcity forced him to source from 2 smaller regional distributors, teaching him, expensively, that not every pallet operation used the same grade of wood. One of the substitute suppliers turned out to favor a softer, cheaper pine that split under his usual joinery, and he lost an entire weekend's work relearning techniques for a wood he thought he already understood. Then, in the business's second year, a mid-size regional hotel group reached out after a designer scouting reclaimed woodmakers for a new boutique property series found Dean's work online. They were furnishing 3 new locations and wanted rustic reclaimed pieces for the lobbies and guest rooms, headboards, entry tables, accent shelving, sourced locally rather than mass manufactured overseas. It was, by a wide margin, the largest order Dean had ever been asked to consider, and it would require him to deliver dozens of matching, high-quality pieces on a fixed commercial timeline, something he'd never attempted at that scale. He said yes before he'd fully worked out how he'd manage it, and then spent the next several nights wondering if he'd made a serious mistake. A single missed deadline on an order this size wouldn't just cost him a client. It could sink the reputation he'd spent nearly 2 years building one small order at a time. He hadn't. It took every lesson from every earlier failure to pull off the hotel order. The moisture-reading instincts from the ruined coffee table, the jigged, consistent joinery from the wobbling legs, the honest photography that had turned a struggling barn workshop into something buyers trusted. Dean brought on his first employee that year, a young woodworker named Wade Kessler from 2 towns over, who'd apprenticed briefly under a cabinet maker before that shop closed. Then a second employee, then a third. The hotel order shipped on time. Every headboard and entry table matched to spec, and the designer who'd placed it referred 2 more properties before the year was out. 3 years after that first truck turned onto the gravel drive, the business, which Carol had eventually convinced Dean to formally name, Millbrook Reclaimed, was doing more than $500,000 a year in revenue. What had been an open barn was now a proper workshop with a small retail showroom out front, its walls lined with the same rough, honest-grained wood that had once sat in a discarded pile out back. Dean had 4 full-time employees, customers in 11 states, and a waiting list for custom orders that stretched 3 months out. He still, whenever a new batch of pallets arrived, walked the load himself before anyone else touched it. Some habits from the first winter had never left him. Gary Pruitt, the neighbor who'd once asked if Dean was opening a landfill, was now the proud owner of a Millbrook reclaimed dining table, which he mentioned to anyone who'd listen. Dean never made a show of the reversal. He didn't need to. The pile of broken wood was gone, replaced piece by furniture that carried its history in visible knots and old nail holes, sitting now in homes and hotel lobbies and coffee shops across the region. Late one evening, closing up the workshop, Dean found himself standing in almost exactly the spot where his grandfather's table used to sit in the old barn, years before any of this started. He thought about the sentence that had followed him around for a year, without his understanding why. There's no such thing as scrap wood, only wood nobody's looked at right yet. He understood it fully now, not as a saying about lumber, but as a way of looking at everything, at a pile of broken pallets nobody else wanted, at a laid-off man sitting in his truck in the driveway, unsure what came next, at 5 quiet acres that had sat empty for years, waiting for someone to look at them right. The story of Millbrook Reclaimed isn't really a story about furniture, or even about pallets. It's a story about what happens when someone chooses to see potential where everyone else has already decided there's nothing left to see. Dean didn't have money, training, or a plan when he started. What he had was a willingness to look a little closer at something everybody else had already written off, and the patience to keep failing at it until he got it right. So here's a question worth sitting with. What's the overlooked opportunity in your own life right now? The thing everyone else has already dismissed that you haven't looked at closely enough yet. Tell us in the comments if you've ever turned a setback into something you're proud of. And if this story was worth your time, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.